Okay. So where do you
Okay.
want to begin?
Well, let's start with the marriage discussion and like all the things that the people that you had were talking about. It was really great just to hear that young people, and I mean, I had that kind of mentality too, like kind of not knowing what marriage is, and
Mhm.
I feel like I didn't really know when I was married. I remember saying to people like, "How does it feel that you're married now?" Because I lived with my husband before we got married, and I was kind of like, it feels safe, and it wasn't until after, he kind of left and all that stuff that I realized what marriage really was. And I did read Tim Keller's book. At least I read three-fourths of it.
Mhm.
I haven't read the last bit of it, but I thought that was really good, um, to help me kind of get a deeper understanding of what marriage is, and that God has really been teaching me that it, like, kind of like he says, like it's a tool, really, for another tool for us to die to ourselves and really fully embody love to
Mhm.
another person.
Mhm.
And which is why I'm still standing for my marriage and for my husband's salvation. It's just, I feel convicted about it. Like, if like if Jesus can like stand for us, and even though we had our backs turned to him, then I can like stand for my husband, and pray
Mhm.
for him and love him, even though I'm super offended by things he does. And I've had to die to myself multiple times with many different things. So I just think that marriage is really just kind of a sacrifice of yourself for another person.
Mhm.
And it kind of makes you into a better person by doing it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's a great thing. Go ahead.
No, no, you're doing fine. I again, it's just because of the ambiguities here. I don't know to what degree, I mean, if we decide to share this or part of it, I mean, because people, the first time we talked, you shared your story quite a bit more. And it's been a couple of years now. And we haven't spoken for a while. So
Yeah.
you I mean, I don't know how you would want to articulate a little bit of your story in a way that people could both understand and then appreciate your comments.
Mm,
Um,
okay. Well, yeah. So I was kind of raised in a Christian home, kind of like a non-denominational, probably like charismatic sort of Christian home, and the Vineyard. If you everybody knows what
okay,
that
yep,
is,
know
you're
the
going to,
vineyard.
yeah. And yeah, but then in college, like most people, I couldn't hold on to whatever I had growing up. Like the materialism kind of hit me, and I couldn't, in college, like there wasn't anything for me to stand on with my faith, in a sense. Like I didn't really understand it, and so I kind of just let it go in college. And in college is when I met my husband, and he's not a believer. Uh, but we got along great, and we fell in love, and we've been together since college. And that was back in uh 20 2005-ish,
Okay.
2004-ish when we met. So it's been a
Mhm.
while. And and then we were together through college, and then out of college. And then, we always wanted to get married, but we lived together first, because I wasn't practicing being a believer, and he had no faith. So, and then we got married in 2011, and yeah, just living together the whole time. And then we bought a house in 2014, and then in 2016 he went on a work trip, and it was only for 2 weeks. But then when he came back, he told me that he was in love with the person that he went on the work trip with. And at that point, I was about a month pregnant. And so that was a blow.
Yeah.
And so, and I feel like in that, it wasn't just that moment, but the subsequent year, maybe even 2 or 3 years after that, there was quite a bit of unraveling of a worldview, for sure, in the first couple months. And when Jordan Peterson talks about the bottom falling out and dropping into uh, the chaos in the ocean, I definitely felt that. I felt like, I don't know, like everything you ever kind of believed or thought kind of just fell out from under you. Like, what is love? What was that we had? Who are you? Just all those questions. And honestly, it created in me kind of this, I felt betrayed, of course, by my husband, but also by the world, like all the lies of uh I don't know, soulmates. Like, 'cause he's like, oh, me and this other woman are soulmates. And I was like, what does that even mean? And all these
That must have felt like a real slap in the face
yeah,
after the years you had been together and that you married.
yeah. I really did feel like slapped in the face by all the things the world says about true love and finding the one, and follow your heart, and just do you and make yourself happy, and like all these things that are kind of antithetical to the Christian worldview, which I had kind of gone along with before. I could now see behind it and just see how much harm those lies can cause people, and how living by them kind of lands you in this place of like, oh shoot, I don't know, just it just kind of backstabbed me.
Yeah.
And so I came back to church pretty quickly. Like, that happened in January, February 2016. And then by June, when I was like in my 5th or 6th month of pregnancy, I went back to church and crying and the whole thing. But
Yeah.
it felt like the right thing to do. It felt good. It felt safe. And everybody had told me, as the world will, like, oh, just take care of you, just do your thing, just screw him, you're going to be good,
Yeah.
move on. But all I wanted to do was to repair the relationship. He was
Mhm.
not into that at all. We
Yeah.
tried a little bit, but he his heart wasn't in it. I can't make him.
Yeah.
Um, so eventually he moved out on his own. He lives with another woman now still. Um,
With the same woman that he met or a different woman?
Same woman, as
Okay.
far as I know. I don't
Okay.
ask a lot of questions.
Yep.
I've learned along the way to just kind of like God do whatever he's doing with him,
Yep.
and just focus on me, and I can't control him. I mean,
Yep.
that was the other thing that kind of crashed down around me, like between a year, the year after it happened, was that I have the illusion of control
Yeah.
went away, that I have no control, and accepting that. And that was tough. That was really hard. I tried to get him into counseling. I tried to appeal to his friends. I tried to appeal to his mother. Like,
Yeah.
everything, anything I could.
Yeah.
I tried to punish, like, well, you're not going to be there for the birth, and you're not going to,
Yeah.
whatever I could do
Yeah.
to try to control.
Yeah.
They all didn't work.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, eventually it was just like, okay, full surrender. Okay, I can't do anything. And the only,
Why did you
go
go
ahead.
back to church? Tell me more about that.
Uh, well, in that period, so it happened in January, and I was just kind of lost and confused in February. And I feel like I tried a couple other things. I went to a meditation weekend.
Mhm.
That did nothing for me. I was just like, I can't do this. I went to, God forgive me, like a Reiki thing,
Uh-huh.
like in Hawaii. Um, that did nothing for me. And I could remember the feelings of kind of belonging and, strangely enough, serenity that I felt when I was kind of a believer, even though I didn't really know that I was. But I know I had experienced God to a certain extent, like going to church camp and, things like that. But I never had a good handle on it, I guess you might say. I didn't really fully understand it. I just kind of assumed, because I grew up in it, I didn't know there was anything different really. So I just kind of thought, well, probably everyone experiences that. Like, I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
Um, but I did, like, I remember going to that Reiki thing. I was with these people, and they said, "Have you ever experienced like a peace, or like just like a where you felt good?" And strangely enough, I was like, "Well, yeah, like when I was a believer, when I went to go to church, like in worship, and I never like I felt more one with nature." And strangely enough, when I was a believer and with God, when I would sit in nature and say, like, God, wow, you built this, you all created all this. Like, I felt more connected to it than I could ever get back to when I wasn't. Because
Mhm.
I, like a lot of people in my generation, I think you live for vacations and trips to try to kind of fill that gap and like, oh, I'm going to go out in nature and hike and I'm really going to like feel it. And I tried to, like we would go on hikes and we would go out and I would try to get back to that place of serenity. But I don't feel like I ever did like I did when I was, I don't know, with God, just for lack of a better phrase. Um, and so anyway, I was trying all those things, like to feel some sort of peace and feel some sort of control when everything was in chaos. And I was just like, I think I got to go to church. I think I got to go to church. And I had told one friend what was going on at the. I didn't tell that many people at the time it was happening because ultimately I wanted reconciliation, and I was like, I can't go around bad mouthing him to everybody if I want reconciliation. And that took a lot of restraint because we worked in the same place and she worked in the same place. We all worked in the same place. And it would be very easy for me to tell people, oh, this is what's happening. Look at what he's doing. Look what she's doing. Outcast them, feel sorry for me.
Yeah.
But that would have just been stepping on my own feet, so to speak, because it would
Yeah.
just make him more mad at me. So I had to
Yeah.
just keep my mouth closed,
Yeah.
which is really hard. And then so yeah, so I did tell one friend, and she was going to church, and so I was like, I need to go to church with you. And so I went with her and another girlfriend that both to the same church, and I just started going back there. And like the first or the second time I went with them, I went to the front and was on my knees crying, and they're like, "What's going on exactly?" So yeah, I was doing that. And then I switched to going to another church, which actually is my parents' church, which you would have told me I would have gone to my parents' church like 8 months before. I've been like, no way. But I I was feeling like once a week wasn't enough for me. I like when you're in the,
Yeah.
in those times you
Yeah.
need more.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to go to like a midweek group or some sort of Bible study.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find one at the church that my friends were going to. And, nothing was going on at their life. They were fine. So they were like, yeah, we want to join one, but they'd been wanting to join one for months and they hadn't. So I just looked up one at my parents' church, and I found one where the pastors, some of the pastors of prayer at my parents' church were actually running it out of their house. And it was like 5 minutes away from my house. It's funny how that happens with God. And like, I just emailed them, I was like, hey, I need to come to this life group. They're like, yeah, come on in. And there I showed up, like, 6 or 7 months pregnant. And they were a great community. And I automatically
Wow.
just got plugged into community and support.
Yeah.
And praise God, none of them told me, I told them my situation, and none of them said, oh, just leave him. They're like, no, we're going to pray for him.
Yeah.
And I'm super grateful for that because
Yeah.
I know that a lot of even church Christians will tell you just like, nah, forget it. It's just not meant to be.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I was really grateful that they kind of came alongside me and prayed with me. Yeah.
But
And
now
so I've been,
you've been
yeah.
living this life now for a long time.
Yeah. Now it's been whenever 2016. So, yeah, it'll
Almost
be
5 years.
yeah, 5 years ish. And along the way there's been a lot of growth, a lot of changes, a lot of eye-opening. Like you've been part of that journey, you and Peterson, like just I don't know, crazy revelation about the world and the way things are. And I think what fueled it was that kind of betrayal by the world. It just like, what is going on? What are all these lies? And they make me mad. They make me mad now. Like I really don't like the way the world talks about things. And I'm like, that's totally a lie. And people believe it, like when people talk, just like for example, when, young women in the workplace, so many young women that I've worked with are like, I don't know if I want to have children. Like, I don't, like I just like my life. And I'm like, you like your life like this, like in a playing, like a field, like you get to do so many things and it's very selfish. But when you have children, your life just goes deep. It's
Mhm.
just like, it's just this depth of living that you can't get without sacrifice, really, you know? Um, yeah. And I try to encourage them, like, no, you want to have children. You do. You'd be a great mother.
Now, a lot of people would, hearing your story, imagine you wouldn't say something like that
Really?
because, well, because someone might say, "Hey, now wait a minute. You you were a month pregnant when your husband left, at
Hmm.
least left the relationship to a significant degree, whatever happened physically. But you now are a mother of a child with, and you're sort of co-parenting with this man at a distance who's not your husband. That's very complex. Um, they might look at you and say, how 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 does being a mother help you? Isn't that just a sacrifice and you're not getting all of the Instagram moments of a happy family and a lovely
The
marriage?"
Instagram moments. Yeah. But it goes back to that like I'm grateful that it happened when I did have a child,
Mhm.
because having her has given me a whole nother sense of meaning and like a way to like propel myself to being better and a reason to be better. And part of, I call it standing, for my marriage, is kind of a legacy aspect for her, like I could have been very easily been bitter and angry and badmouthed her father.
Yes.
But instead, because I felt convicted by God, and because He loved me first, I don't. It's hard to explain it. I decided to choose love instead. The Bible does say love always wins, and so I'm holding on to that. Um, that I can show her through example a better way through than the way the world would have you react,
Yeah.
the selfish way. And it's kind of like a challenge, but that's worth it. It's kind of like it's issued me this challenge to do better because of her. uh and I want to meet that challenge. And I just keep thinking that I want the happy ending, in a sense, and I can't get that happy ending. I can't write that happy ending. Only God can write that happy ending for our story. And that for her, when God writes that happy ending, whatever it looks like, that's kind of like added into her story, like you talk about. I mean, like we're our own biographies, our own stories, but we're also our parents' stories and where we come from stories. And, she won't really remember this time that much
No.
to a certain degree. But that when it becomes part of our story, it becomes part of her story in
Yeah.
legacy, you
Yeah.
might say.
Yeah.
And I feel that's like a great gift that I can give her, in a sense.
Now, I think a lot of people, if we ever share this video, a lot of people watching this video would look at you and say, "You're stupid," because they would say, "Hey, look, you're a young woman. You have a chance for love. Why don't you be more selfish?" And, he left you. No, this is no, there's nothing on you against, there's no tag against you. I mean, and why don't you, why on earth would you continue to stand for a marriage that your partner doesn't want? They would look at that and say, "This is stupid. This is," I would bet a lot of people listening to this would go as far as to say, "You're not being fair to you." I
Mhm.
think that's exactly what they would say to you about the decisions that you're making.
Yeah.
What's your answer to that?
Well, I feel like that's what Jesus does for us. And many times in this process, I think I've I've, cried God or whatever and been like, you don't know how I feel. And then I go, oh, wait a minute. You know exactly how I feel.
Mm,
And you've walked this road before. And I feel like He's been like my constant companion, because He might, well, there's other women that are walking the same path that I've been connected with, which is great.
yeah.
Um,
which is something that would surprise a lot of people if they just sort of look at TV and the media and things. But if you are actually in churches, other places, networks, what you say is very true.
yeah, and but he's been a companion because he's walked this path before and done it so well, that uh, and I feel like he's given me grace to do it. One thing that really has propelled me to is I don't think, I mean, I can think in my delusional moments that maybe he's happier or maybe that he's fine or whatever, but I can't think, I honestly, I believe that he's doing something out of his own woundedness, and making a decision that anybody, even someone in the world, would say is a mistake. And I can't help but think that someday he will be regretful. And I when I see the regretful him in the future, like, I'll break down and cry because I feel like the only thing that closes the happy ending off for both of us is if I turn away, you know? Like, if I say, "Screw this, I'm gonna choose selfishness. I'm not doing this anymore." I just kind of close that door to reconciliation and, um, uh, I don't know what restoration that I so desperately want for him and myself. And I kind of keep it open because I still want it because of my daughter and for his future self,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
because I know the person that he is right now, it may be a little delusional, you know, deceived, and that the person that he was wouldn't have wanted this. And I just feel like the person that he is later will be the one wouldn't have wanted this necessarily.
Yeah.
It might just be something that has to happen to so we know, maybe it's something that we needed to walk through, but um yeah.
If he never comes back, would this still be worth it for you?
Yes.
Why?
Why? I'm grateful that it happened, strangely enough, because of the revelation that I've had, the growing that I've had because of it, um, the depth of understanding of what love really is, of what marriage really is, uh, the freedom that really comes from dying to yourself. Like I couldn't have had all that if I hadn't gone through this. So I'm very grateful for it. Um, I have asked, God, like, don't jerk me around like that, like
Yeah.
but I've also had to come to terms like, well, if he never comes back with that, it's his choice, and I just know that I lived the way I was supposed to,
Mhm.
um and I loved deeply, and yeah, and I showed my daughter a different way than bitterness and fighting and
Yeah.
things like that,
I'm really sorry to ask you such hard questions, but I think they're important because not every story in this world ends happily, and I know that, and I deeply respect the choices that you've made because, you have it would have it would have been so natural and easy to turn to bitterness and retribution and anger and to mobilize um, all of your resources to hurt his reputation and to I mean because that's the program people normally follow with stories like yours. That's the natural course, and you have turned away from that course at great sacrifice to yourself. And I would never want to discourage you from that path because it's it's the godly path. I mean, you are doing the right thing, but it's a very costly path. And
Yeah.
I also know, and I think part of the story of Jesus is that in this world, doing the right thing doesn't necessarily pan out. I mean, they hung him on a cross. I mean, that's the story.
Yeah, yeah. I watched your video when you were discussing that with Jordan Peterson. I was like, oh, it's very true.
That's the story.
Yeah.
And, obviously, if you're not, and this is what I emphasize to people, that people like to follow the story of Jesus, kind of, all the way up to the cross, and then they get skeptical about the resurrection. And when they do that, you lose a huge piece of the story, because it's really hard not to look at the story without the resurrection of Jesus and say, oh, that's a lovely story, how noble of him, but in the end, he's a loser.
Right.
And the resurrection changes that dynamic completely. And so I look at, and this is what we talked about before too, I look at your cruciform choices with respect to what happened to you, and I look at it and I say, you are embodying the way of Christ. That is a costly path, and you are paying the price. And so you know, it's that's always the way it is with the cruciform path. When you watch people walk it, part of you just longs for something better for them, but the cost. But yet,
Right.
Again, every time I talk to you about this, there's no turning back with you. You always say, no, this is the path. I'm going to walk it. I'm going to walk it in faith. I'm going to walk it in trust. And if God, in fact, sometime in the future gives me the desire of my heart, I will praise him. And if that doesn't happen, I will praise him still. That's what I hear coming from you.
True. Yes.
It's a
Amen.
huge thing.
I was gonna ask you if you've seen the movie A Hidden Life.
I haven't yet. A number of people have said you should watch it, but I haven't seen it yet.
Oh my gosh, it's really, really slow.
Yeah,
But
that's what I know about his movies.
but it's so beautiful. I, I work in film, right? So my job is story. So whenever you talk about story, I get all excited,
Okay.
because I live in that world of story. And I've learned so much from Peterson and Pageau about story as well. But The Hidden Life, there's not, so anyway, to say this, there's not that many movies that I'm like, oh yay, I love that movie. I'm really skeptical, and I'm really critical of like almost all entertainment movies. But this movie had me crying. It was just so beautiful. But because it's the story, it's that story, it's the Christ story in a man's life. And it's just like the cost to follow Christ in this world is so heavy. It's so heavy. Yeah, and that's what the story is about. It like you say, it doesn't, when people, like, I remember reading reviews of it, because it doesn't necessarily end well for him, but it's such a triumph. At the end, it's such a triumph because he didn't give in. He didn't give in, and his life is a conviction on everybody that he encounters. And it's I don't know, it's just amazing. It's really slow, but it's really beautiful. But it's drawn out because you could see him wrestling with the cost of it. You could see him wrestling with it, with his wife, with the townspeople, with everything, But he can't go against his conviction. Like, he just can't. And there's a really great, I won't spoil it for you, but there's a really great monologue by this guy who's painting the church, and you'll like it. You'll like it. Just be patient.
I told my wife last night. Well, I was looking at a review on YouTube while she was trying to get some work done next to me, and I said, here's the funny thing about, even with spoilers, here's the funny thing about movie reviews. For a good movie, a movie review, even with spoilers, doesn't ruin it, because the movie continues to be a revelation. With a
Mm.
bad movie, you can spoil it because like it has one trick and there's the trick and then you're done. So that's, maybe we should talk about storytelling, because I've been talking about storytelling a lot lately, because
You have.
I've been I've been thinking about, so with, part of my scheme about Peterson is that with his ceiling that he tries to hold because of his evolutionary scientism and such, he really resists. And speaking as a scientist, speaking as a psychologist, someone always says he really resists sort of defaulting to more broadly longer term Christian ideas such as revelation, that the God of the universe could represent himself in a human being. Of course, Christians say that is Jesus Christ, definitively, and that in some ways that definitive revelation, that definitive image expresses revelation at a higher degree than we can necessarily build ourselves up to. I think that's sort of my shorthand
Mm.
understanding of general and special revelation. Now, having said that, Christianity has always asserted, as the Apostle Paul does in a number of places in the New Testament, and I think as the psalmists do, that we can, in fact, have a knowledge of God by looking at his revelation. And that's in the Psalms. The Apostle Paul says it. And so I've been thinking a lot about Jonathan Peugeot's parasitic storytelling video. Really got me thinking about revelation in terms of storytelling, because if a story is true, let's say true in the way that a bicycle tire is true, or true in the way that aiming can be true, the truer a story, the more reciprocal broadening that story should
Mm.
have. And that's why, you know, and I know whenever I say this, that's why certain kinds of storytelling have reciprocal narrowing, because there's, I don't know what you think, but I've watched my share of bad Christian movies where the end of the movie is wonderful. I'm a Christian minister and I believe the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I want more people to come to Christ, but certain kinds of Christian movies are just like these little one trick ponies, that
Yes.
here, okay, so they became a Christian, we're all happy, movie done. It's like, you could have told me that movie in 3 minutes. But good storytelling actually tends to be reciprocally broadening,
Yeah.
and it illuminates more of the world as the story is told. And
Yes. Yes.
so, and sort of, I'm doing a lot of thinking lately about, okay, why is that? Because that seems to be what I see in storytelling. Why why is that? And if in fact that is the case, how might we then, in a sense, grow in our knowledge of God by pursuing storytelling?
That's a big question.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm thinking about lately, and why I've been
Yeah.
talking about storytelling so much. So I don't know if
Yes.
you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I have tons of thoughts on storytelling. Just well, like because you talk about storytelling, like everything is narrative, and for whatever reason, God has wired us to really respond to narrative, and like, but within narrative, there's so many. I don't know. When you listen to people that really like Pajot and other people that really break down like elements of the Bible, like so it's like a like even Peterson, like it's just this little paragraph, but there's so much in it based like even like when you know the Hebrew and the stuff like that, like and you know the customs, you can unpack this thing that like tells so much. It's really amazing, and it has implications on so many things. But the narrowing comes from like you said in your video yesterday about it feels preachy. It's like there's a foregone conclusion that you're trying to hammer over people's heads, and like I just feel like that's just kind of propaganda for lack of a better, and it kind of just tells people what to think instead of asking questions and not really forming a complete answer. you know, a lot of times when you're coming up with a movie, I think the best thing to do is like pose a question that this movie is kind of pondering. You know, like what is like like what, like can trust be restored after betrayal? Like you could do a movie about that question and like explore the different answers to that within characters. And then you would explore here's a here's a character where it didn't quite work, and here's a character where it kind of worked. Or, you know, you would explore different avenues of that. It's very hard when you're coming up with stories because I spend time in the story room to really limit yourself to that question because it's easy to get caught up in like, oh, well, maybe it's about, I don't know, just trust, or maybe it's just about, I don't know, maybe that's love. It's hard to like narrow in on like, no, 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 we have to kind of stay within this parameter. Otherwise, it gets too broad. It just goes out. But it's very easy to go to get broad out. I often, I've made this diagram. Here it is sitting in front of me. But so like, I don't know if you could read it. It's backwards. Is it backwards to you?
No, it's good.
Oh,
Plot, character, psych, and theme.
theme,
And what's at the
meaning.
bottom? Oh, meaning.
So a lot of times I feel like when I'm in the story room, we end up talking about plot,
Hmm.
which is like what happens in the movie.
Hmm.
Uh, but and that's motivated by character,
Hmm.
right? Like the plot is like what the character does. But and that's why I wrote psych next to the character because that's psychology,
Hmm.
which has really been Jordan Peterson helped me. Like how do characters, how do people see the world? They see it as a place in which to act and make decisions, to act out what they believe. Um, but all of that points to meaning within the story because ultimately you're a story in it is telling you how to that's why people like stories, how to behave in the world. It's telling you how to act in the world. And the story, whether it starts out with a point of view or not, I think sometimes it's dangerous to start out with a really distinct point of view because that's where you get into that propaganda territory. But you're ultimately saying something about the way in which to act, not because you're telling it, but because you're showing it. And at the bottom is theme and meaning. And when you change things on the top, which sometimes happens in filmmaking process, you'll be like, oh, well, the character will just do this. And it's like, well, that character wouldn't do that. The character you set up wouldn't do that in this scene. That you've just lost me. I don't care about them anymore because they don't behave how a human being should behave. And when you change things in the plot, you automatically change the meaning too, because you're changing the character. So you're changing what the movie's about. And sometimes the theme is moving all over the place and we're not kind of holding course. I think it's the director's job, writer's job to hold course and to like generally like what you're aiming at, but it's very hard to do that with 1,000 voices and things going on in your head.
That's really true. And that was really helpful for me because, my idea is that what story is this sort of massive lossy compression algorithm. Now, anybody who knows anything about computer graphics understands that some kinds of compression are lossy and some kinds of compression are lossless. Now, lossless compression has improved lately because computing power has improved and all that. But at the beginning, we mostly had a lot of lossy compression. And so, that's where you get Jordan Peterson's uh, resolution analogy, where this is high resolution, this is low resolution.
Hmm.
And often the difference is loss and lossiness. Well, storytelling, I think narrative is an incredibly powerful compression algorithm by which we can take worlds
Mm,
and put them down into very limited elements. And part of with filmmaking, part of what's powerful about filmmaking is that it is a very broad canvas in that you have image, and now especially with computer graphics, there's there's a lot you can do with images. You have music, you have dialogue, you have plot, you have all of these elements that can be brought together to a movie. But like you said, part of what you need with a compression algorithm is also a degree of discipline
yes.
where in some ways, and this is the same for sermons, which I'm really bad at in a lot of ways, because the death of most sermons is too many disconnected thoughts. And it's the same for movies.
Oh, for
But
sure.
I think you said that very well, that when you start out with a distinct point of view, that can, I like, if the point of my sermon is this, so sometimes writing sermons, you write down your point first. If that's the point first, that could be the death of the sermon, because well, there's the point, but it's right there. And in a sense, the goal of a sermon, or in many ways in a bigger canvas, the goal of the movie is to enflesh. It's not just the point, but the world has to come to that point in the process
Yeah.
of the storytelling or the sermon or whatever you're doing. So, and it's a that doing it well, and we're not even exactly sure. We know when it's done well and we know when it's done poorly, but to say why and how, I mean,
I
it's
mean, there's
something that's beyond
books and
us.
books. Everybody in Hollywood is trying to figure that out. Like if
Yeah.
there's classes and books every couple years. There's a new one. Like, have you read this method of storytelling? And from Joseph Campbell to the Save the Cat. I don't know. There's so many that people read to try to like get a handle, you might say, on it. But it's very elusive. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to talk about uh, was so I read. Have you read Tolkien's On Fairy Stories?
Yes.
So I was reading that, and what really stuck out to me was enchantment versus magic.
I should read that again. It's been a few years.
So
Just keep talking.
this idea of enchantment, which he distinguishes from magic, which I never really had before, but like, and then I also listened to this YouTube video called the it's about C.S. Lewis, and it's about the other magician, and it's talking about science as the other magician, and there was that idea that alchemy was a thing, and that's kind of magic, and when you talk about trying to get a handle and control things, like magic seems to be like science, like it's very much trying to wield something, trying to control something, where an enchantment, when Tolkien talks about the magic of the elves, it was an enchantment, it was like an inviting sort of like, come participate, but it wasn't, let me control you and you do this thing.
Right.
And I feel like if you think about, I don't know, the kingdom of heaven or God, he's very much about enchantment. And the other way, the world's way, is very much about magic, like control. And I don't know, it's just something I've been thinking a lot about lately. And it's interesting. I had never thought about that. Because another thing I'd like to think about a lot too is like the loss of wonder and in the current age, and how everybody is just dying and aching for wonder in their life. But like you talk about, the scientific age has really sucked all the wonder out of life, and there's something to losing control that gets you wonder. Like when you're a child, when you don't control everything, and when their parent says, "Come with me, we're gonna do this really fun thing," and you just kind of go because you trust them, and they take you, and it's like the most. It's so everything is so much more wondrous when you're a child because you have a loss of control, but you have trust. And so when you're in that place of enchantment, wonder, life just seems so much better, and it feels so much more exciting. But when you try to control everything, when you try to be certain about everything, there's a lot of wonder lost, you know? And people talk about magic, like in a wondrous way, but magic is actually not so wondrous. It's more about control.
Yes.
And so a distinction between the two is kind of interesting.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And I think that gets at this reciprocal broadening versus reciprocal narrowing, because enchantment gives a broader world. So the magic of the elves, rope, with the elves, their rope is more ropey, and the knots hold better, and they can untie, and they're smaller and lighter, yet they're stronger. The clothing covers more. The clothing does what clothing is supposed to do
Mm-hmm.
better. And that's this broadening effect.
Yeah.
Whereas magic, like technology, is all about confinement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And in a sense, what you do, I like to think of this with the language of power over versus power through. So
Mm,
power over, if I have power over someone, there I restrict and constrain their agency.
right.
But that's not the kind of power God gives. God's power is power through. So
Right.
that I, through the Holy Spirit, I actually have more agency, not less. And the discipline is self-discipline, which is different from the constraints of another on us, because constraints of another on us is about our weakness, whereas self-discipline is about our strength. Exercising self-discipline actually makes us stronger.
Yeah. Empowers.
Yes, it
Empowers.
empowers.
Right.
So
Yeah.
no, that was really helpful. And
Yeah.
oh, hang on a second. I got the alarm repair guy here. Hang on, just I'm going to pause. So the alarm guy is here. So there's about to be a really big noise,
Oh,
which will
okay.
come through, but that's okay. We can keep going.
Do you have a meeting at 3?
No, I don't. I don't.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
we still have more time.
Okay. So yeah, so that's another thing I've been thinking about: enchantment versus magic. And I really should try to read, I don't know, more Barfield, but I haven't plunged into that yet.
Barfield's hard. He's not the writer Lewis is. Lewis,
Lewis is a great writer. Oh my gosh.
he's a great writer. And Lewis can take really difficult ideas and make them clear. Barfield doesn't quite have that same gift. But Barfield and Barfield really has a handle on this movement from original participation to loss of participation to final participation. And in some ways, that, because every story is a journey, NT Wright in NT Wright has his middlebrow books, he has his kind of every believer books, and then he has his technical books. And his magnum opus in the technical books actually begins with a treatment of story.
Oh, I should read that.
Yeah, it's in the old, is it it's the People of God book. So he's got this series of 5 books, thick
Mm.
books. But that was one of the first, when I started reading NT Wright and I started tackling that first book of his, that was one of the things. Why is this New Testament scholar talking about story? And so, with Barfield, every good story, has this journey in it and there's lots of different ways that people talk about it. Northrop Thright talks about, the U-shaped story. Um, and what's interesting with Barfield is that the final participation is in fact, and this is true of the Christian story. We begin to we grow in a capacity that we on one hand have sort of lost, but because of the loss, we now have it in a way we could not have had it without the loss.
Right.
And that's because, part of what Christians struggle with is the question of, well, Lord, why did you let these bad things happen? And every Christian struggles with that.
Mhm.
Why did you let these bad things happen? If you're sovereign, if you're in control, why did you let these bad things happen? And even in asking the question, we we would like to imagine that the answer is something that would satisfy us and is small enough that we could understand it. And I have suspicions that those two things aren't the case.
Mm,
And part of those suspicions are because of the shape of the book of Job. Because in the beginning, there's a simple little story by which we all know why Job is suffering, even though he's the best man in the world. And at the end of the story, God could have said, well, had the court in and the accuser came in and I had a conversation. I said, have you considered my servant Job? And I mean, the end of this book of the story could have retold the story in the beginning of the book, but it doesn't. And God never bothers to explain himself to Job, even though the story has explained itself to the audience already,
mm,
which leads me to believe that at some point we will grow into an answer that we, at this point, cannot really comprehend or adequately embrace. That's my
right.
suspicion.
Yeah. And I think that the I think there's kind of like micro examples of that, like in life, like kind of like learning to trust God. You kind of have to like open up a space for Him to work in your life, where you kind of let go of control, and then you kind of step back and let Him do His thing, and just kind of trust and go along with it. And if that, and I've done those small things, and then it pans out, continually, like in enough time that you can see it working. So I suppose you have to have those experience, so you know that that will pattern will be like fractal. It scales over time, like, or over lifetime, or in different situations, that same thing will happen in another situation,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that it might be satisfactory, but not the way you thought it was supposed to be satisfactory. You've kind of surrendered your um, the way it has to happen.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, yeah,
Oh, I think that's right. And it's part of the hubris of sort of the straightforward view that modernity offers us is the implication that we we see things as they are and we can see all there is.
hmm,
And neither of those things are true.
right,
And so built into a lot of our complaints are those two assumptions. And that begins then to set us up to live only within the very narrow parameters of that which we can see and that which we can comprehend. And
right,
that is a much smaller world than
yeah,
the one
yeah,
we
yeah,
actually enjoy.
yeah. And one time, I don't know if it was you or if it was another, pastor I was listening to, that defining that definition of what is good and what is bad and what it has to be is kind of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? I mean, it's like, I say this is what it should be, and if it doesn't fit into that, then it isn't. It isn't good,
That's
or
right.
it is bad. And kind of taking those parameters off kind of opens things up to seeing things different, and it also gets you back to that wonder, because you're like, I could be surprised in a good way this way.
Yeah. No, that's very true. That's very true. Well, what else do you have on your list? This has been delightful, and I'm
Oh,
really happy with this conversation, and I hope that we can share it. So,
I don't
because
think I've said anything that is going to get me in too much trouble. What is? Oh, I had this other thought about as God as the solution between the harmony between chaos and order. Kind of goes back to that wonder thing. So if you think of it visually, like if you're walking through a dark place, that's pretty chaotic, like a room you don't know and is unfamiliar. But the solution would be someone that you trust, that you love, that can see in the dark, that you can hold
yeah,
their hand.
yeah,
And that's kind of how I think of it. So it's still kind of an adventure. It still kind of gets you on this journey, your own hero's journey, so to speak. I think that's one of the reasons why Peterson has done so good, is he's kind of enticed people to engage with their own hero's journey, you know.
Yeah. Yes.
And but yeah, anyway, God is like the ultimate mentor, if you might, in like the in that hero's journey, you know.
Well, and I think, and this is what I think why a lot of Christians, I don't know if they would know what they're doing, but why a lot of Christians long for Peterson to, in a more overt way, embrace the hero. And of course, Christians believe that Jesus Christ is the hero, is because in this world, many heroes' journeys are sad stories. I mean, I love reading history, and there are many tragic stories in history about people who have set off on a heroic journey and lost.
Mm.
And Tolkien, of course, writes these journey stories because the first story is about Bilbo's journey, and then the Lord of the Rings is about Frodo's journey, and of course the journey of the whole world too. But um, there are many in this world. There are many heroic journeys that just end in crucifixion.
Mm.
But what I think part of what happens in Christianity with Christ is that even even historic journeys that end in what looks like, again, and it's really important to understand that the cross looks like, to everyone who's observing it, the complete loss of Jesus. That is in that frame, in that story. Crucifixion is the definition of loss of messiahs. Messiahs are killed by Rome. That's the story. And what Christ then does in his resurrection is give hope for all crucified heroes.
Mm. Mm.
And so, we've seen Peterson on his own heroic journey, and it's not over yet.
No.
But I think part of why many Christians long for him to embrace the resurrection and the resurrected Christ is because that finally changes even tragic heroic stories. And so some of other, oh, there's the alarm, it's not too bad. That's why I haven't closed the door. Christ ultimately, I mean, that's in many ways the function of the resurrection. But now, if the Christian story ended on that first Easter Sunday, that would be a great story because Jesus would have won. And that's usually where movies sort of end.
Mm.
But in the time between Jesus' resurrection and our resurrections, what he affords is all of this much more story making, and he invites our story into his, that we may follow in his footsteps. And that's basically what the Apostle Paul says in Romans 6. We are baptized into his baptism and into his death, and then we are raised with him in resurrection.
Mm.
And so, I think I'd love to see Peterson um, be able to embrace that story, and therefore, in a sense, say to the world, you may kill me, but my victory is bound up in the victory of Jesus Christ. That is a powerful thing, because what that means is that we can, in fact, set off on journeys that almost everyone in this world will look at us and say, that journey is bound to fail, because many good efforts in this world are bound to fail. But in Christ, we can embrace journeys and heroic efforts that are bound to fail, and die in the process, having the world look at it like failure, and in him finally, you know,
There's victory.
have the victory.
Right. Did
So
you know that word eucatastrophe?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So sorry,
Anyway.
sorry for the little sermon there.
No, I love it. It's great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What else did I write in here? Oh, I wrote about how I really just you and Peugeot and so many people you have on your channel. I just think it's really great how it feels like there's a unity among denominations, kind of the denominational walls kind of crumble and you just kind of
Yeah,
come together. And it's a very heartwarming thing. I love, I love watching it. I think it's great. And there's so much about going back to like some of the early, like Peugeot does this, like he talks about, I haven't read all those things, like the early church fathers and all those. I'm sure there's a wealth of knowledge in it. I've put some books in my cart, but I haven't ordered them. I haven't read them. I'm a really, really slow reader. It's easier for me to watch YouTube videos. I just rely on you and him to like inform me. But it's so interesting how relevant those older ideas are, or they're coming
yeah,
back. And there just seems to
yeah,
be something between the old meeting the new, and I feel like there's like a re-enchantment between of the world, like between that old idea, like when Barfield talks about these different ages and like consciousness, it feels like the old and the new need to like kind of come together and
yeah,
make a new understanding, like a new consciousness in a sense.
yeah,
But it feels like we're like at that place
yeah.
when I hear you guys all talking and stuff like that.
Well, I think that's true, and I think it is. I think it is happening, and it's it there is sort of a cyclical aspect to it happening. I mean, it has happened in the past. I think, Lewis and the Inklings, Lewis and
Hmm.
Tolkien, that very much was sort of a blossoming of it there. And we've been sort of energized by that blossoming. Now, hopefully we will be able to do our part and offer something that the next generation can continue on.
Yeah.
And, Jesus, that's built into the gospel in the promise that the gates of hell will not finally prevail against his church. And by church, like you say, one of the really gratifying things of this journey for me has been, I've been deeply enriched by my experience and my conversations with Roman Catholics and with Orthodox Christians, those beyond my own um, Dutch Reformed tribe. And finding deeper commonalities between us that perhaps were sort of covered up by the um, by a lot of the debris of past bickerings and warfares. So
Yeah. Forgot how similar we all are actually.
yeah,
We just have
yeah,
different names for the same things.
yeah,
Very
yeah,
strange.
yeah. So may that continue.
Yes.
Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much. I'm not going to mention your name because I don't know if we have, and that way gives you a little bit more anonymity. But
Oh, okay.
It, I just don't want to. I just don't want to raise any difficulties for you because we all have jobs and relationships and networks and stuff, and not everyone can be as open on the internet as I am. I'm a little bit older, and so in some ways I have less to lose. But
Yeah.
it's always so good to talk to you. I'll just end the recording here, and that way I
Okay.
can I can properly thank you.